Welcome to Princeton Public Library. I'm Janie Herman, the Public Programming Librarian, and I'm so glad that you are here with us as we introduce this book, Leading with Feeling, written by Dr. Cary, Cherniss, and Dr. Cornelia Roche, and there'll be a conversation tonight with Amanda Rose. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few logistical things. You can see that right below the screen, there is a link for purchase, Leading with Feeling. If you click there, you'll be brought to the website of the book. Also, you can see that there is a ask a question function. Please feel free to put your questions in there, and you can also upvote those questions at any time to ensure that they get asked. We're going to only leave the chat on for the first few minutes of the talk until we get going, and then it'll be shut down. But we'll turn the chat on again at the end during the question and answer period so that you can ask anybody questions that you need to. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our moderator for the evening, who will then introduce our panelists. So first I am going to bring up Dr. Amanda Rose. Hello, Dr. Rose. Dr. Amanda Rose is an organizational, educational, and leadership consultant and executive coach. Her clients have included Princeton University, Merrill Lynch, the Provident Bank, and the Provident Bank, Merck & Company, Princeton Day School, the Wharton School, Bristol Myers Squibb, among many others. Amanda is affiliated with the University of Pennsylvania, where she is a member of the Wharton School's Executive Development Program's Leadership Workshop. In specific, she's a staff leader and teaching assistant for the course Leadership, Designing the Future. Amanda earned a doctorate in organizational psychology from Rutgers University, an MA in organizational psychology from Columbia, and a BA from Cornell. She currently serves on the board of the Princeton Children's Fund, and she is a local Princeton resident who is frequently in our library, and both she and her mom are well known to our library staff. And we're just so thrilled to have her here with us tonight to lead this program. So I'm going to be disappearing off screen, and I'm going to let Amanda take it away.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you to the Princeton Public Library for hosting tonight's book talk. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to speak with Drs. Cary, Cherniss, and Dr. Cornelia Roche about their new book, Leading with Feeling, 9 Strategies of Emotionally Intelligent Leadership. Cary is the director and co-chair of the Consortium for Research on Emotional Intelligence and professor of applied psychology emeritus at Rutgers University. He's the author of over 70 scholarly articles and book chapters, as well as 7 books, including The Emotionally Intelligent Workplace, co-authored with Daniel Goleman. In addition to his research and writing, Cary has consulted with many organizations in both the public and private sectors. Hi, Cary. Dr. Cornelia Roche has been an executive coach in both corporate and nonprofit organizations. For many years, she served as a staff member on the Wharton School's Executive Development Program, and she's been affiliated with the Emotional Intelligence Consortium since its inception in 1996. She has a doctorate in organizational psychology from Rutgers, too. Hi, Cornelia.
Hi.
I've known Cary and Cornelia for over 20 years. Cary was my professor, my dissertation advisor, mentor, and friend, and Cornelia and I were classmates at Rutgers and colleagues at Penn. So I'm especially delighted to be here tonight and talk to you about this book, which is extremely helpful for people like me, practitioners working with clients in developing emotional intelligence. So, for those who have yet to read the book, can you tell us what it's about?
I would be delighted to do that. But first of all, let me say I'm also delighted to be here because, by the way, I have a little technical problem. I'm getting an echo feedback on my voice. So Becky, if you can do something with that, that would be good. Anyway, I was going to say that I'm really delighted to be here because libraries have always played a very important role in my family. And I think this is the first book talk that I've done in a library. So it really is a treat. So what's the book about? Well, it's based on a research project that we did with a group of outstanding leaders working in a variety of different organizations. These were individuals who were not only identified as being really effective and successful, but also being particularly effective in using and managing emotion, both their own emotions and the emotions of other people. So we sat down with each of them individually, and we conducted what's called the behavioral event interview. And what that involved very simply is that we asked them to think of one or more incidents in which they had to use or manage emotion in order to deal with a critical challenge or opportunity. And so doing that, we got over 100 different incidents. And as we were analyzing the data, what emerged were these 9 strategies that most of the leaders we interviewed used in a lot of different incidents. And so that's what the book is really about. Each chapter focuses on one of those strategies, and we have a lot of stories and examples that come directly from the interviews with the leaders themselves. And that's about it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So why did you write it? Like, what was it about the need that you saw for this topic at this time?
Well, it really goes back to earlier in my career when I was doing research on stress and burnout. And what I found over and over again was that of all the different factors that contributed to burnout in the workplace, more often than not, the most important factor had to do with the person's boss or with other leaders in the organization. And those leaders were either a major source of stress, or they were available to provide support and guidance and direction that really help people working in stressful situations to thrive and not burn out. Mm-hmm. So when I began to work with Dan Goleman on emotional intelligence shortly after his very popular book on emotional intelligence back in 1995, I realized that one of the things that those leaders had that made them so effective, or that prevented them from being such bad bosses, had a lot to do with emotional intelligence. And so that really led to the research that we did and the book. And when we ended up with these strategies, what really led to the book at that point was the realization that these were outstanding leaders, but really any leader, and in fact, any person in any situation, personal life, work life, could use these strategies to leverage their emotional intelligence and to help them to be more effective in dealing with the problems of life. Yeah. So that was why we wrote the book.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, these are skills that are really great need among our leaders today, for sure. How did the two of you come together to collaborate on it and work on this?
Well, Amanda, I can answer that question because I was the one that reached out to Cary. So I was at Rutgers studying organizational psychology in the mid-90s. And in about 97, which was the consortium for emotional intelligence, when it was being formed, I worked as a research associate helping to do some of the research around finding programs that organizations had that were sort of targeted towards developing these competencies, emotional competencies. And remember, this was kind of new. This was after Dan Goleman's groundbreaking book, Emotional Intelligence. And so, we're trying to find programs that companies were already utilizing to do this. So fast forward many years, I'm out in the consulting field, and I missed my research roots. I was missing that collaboration and that study of leadership. And so I contacted Cary and asked him if he knew of any research going on. And he said, "What about mine?" And so I said, "Yay." So that's how we got back together. And so we've always had this common interest. And I have to say, Cary's a very emotionally intelligent person to work with. So it was a really great opportunity for me.
Yeah. Yes, definitely.
One of the best decisions I ever made.
Thank you.
Yeah, many of us are familiar with the term emotional intelligence by now. It's around. It's become kind of very popular in the business literature and psychology literature, but I don't know if people know what it actually is. So can you describe what is emotional intelligence?
Okay, so the textbook definition is it's the ability to accurately perceive, understand, and manage one's emotions and the emotions of other people. But I think the best way to answer the question and define emotional intelligence is to give you an example. And one of our favorite examples from the study and in the book involved an incident that was described to us by the CEO of a fairly large engineering firm. And she described an incident that occurred during a period when the firm was going through some really difficult times financially. And in fact, they had just very recently laid off employees for the first time in the history of the company. I mean, up to then, that was something that, they would never do, but they had to do it then. So the CEO met with her management team every week, the top management team, and they'd go around and they'd give these reports. And, for many weeks, the reports were genuinely pretty negative and discouraging. And then there was one meeting where one of the people, I guess it was the chief financial officer, gave a more upbeat report. They had actually done pretty well during the last week in terms of making their numbers. And he finished the report and everybody sort of nodded, and then they started on the next item on the agenda. And the CEO, who was one of the outstanding leaders in our study, said, wait. Let's stop for a minute and talk more about this. This is fantastic. This is great news. What were all of you people doing that helped us to do this? So they took a couple of minutes out to talk about, how good it was and what they had done. And then they moved on to the next thing on the agenda. And that is really a wonderful example of emotional intelligence in action. Mm-hmm. First of all, like many of the other leaders, she was very closely monitoring the emotional climate within the group. That's something that a lot of these leaders were doing a lot of the time. So that when she realized that the group was not really responding to this good news, she understood that this was potentially a lost opportunity. So that's the perception and that's the understanding. And that's when she jumped in and she said, wait, this is great news. Let's talk about it. And that was the management part. Mm-hmm. So this is how many leaders use their emotional intelligence, perceiving, understanding, and using emotion.
So it sounds like it is preferable and very useful for our leaders to be emotionally intelligent. But does it make them more effective as well? And assuming so, how?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, because when Dan Goleman's book first came out in 1995, there were a lot of people who were very excited, and they said, yes, he's nailed it, that's good. But there was also a lot of skepticism. There was skepticism in the business community, and there was a lot of skepticism in the scientific community. But fortunately, we've had a lot of research during the last 25 years. And a lot of that research has really focused on just this question that Amanda asked. Emotional intelligence is nice. It's nice when you got a boss who's very empathic and pats you on the back. But what about the bottom line? And what the research has been showing time after time is that, in fact, there's a pretty positive, strong association between emotionally intelligent leadership and individual and organizational performance. One of the most dramatic examples of this, in my mind, was a study that was published a couple of years ago in one of the leading journals in the field. That was based on a meta-analysis of many other studies. And for those of you who don't have a statistical background, meta-analysis is basically a statistical technique that allows researchers to take the results of a large number of independent studies that looked at the same thing, the same question, and pool the results so that statistically you could find out what the basic underlying result was. So in this meta-analysis that they published, they looked at a dozen different studies involving over 2,700 employees in a large variety of different organizations. And they found that workers who were more productive tended to have more emotionally intelligent bosses. And in fact, the boss's emotional intelligence accounted for about 23% of the variance in worker performance. Now, for someone who's not familiar with this kind of research, that might seem like, well, you know, that's not great. That's not even a quarter. But when you consider all the other factors that go into a worker's performance, accounting for 23% of it by the boss's emotional intelligence, I mean, that's a big deal. Yeah. So, but I think another way to answer it might be to look at one of these studies. So let me turn it over to Cornelia, who I think has some information about that.
Yeah, I mean, the one study that comes to mind that we mentioned in the book was done by Google. It's a more recent study. It was an internal study. So I'm not sure if this was actually published in any journal or peer-reviewed sort of way, but I think it's really interesting because one of the things that's known out there is that leaders who are low in emotional intelligence usually don't know it. And so Google wanted to find out why would good employees leave their company? So being Google, their data analytics, they had all sorts of data at their disposal. So they looked at past performance reviews. They looked at awards for different managers. And I think they looked over about they had 10,000 incidents and 100 different variables in this study. And
Wow.
what they found was that bad bosses are the reason why most people leave.
Mm.
And that the link is that the leaders or the managers that were low in EI, they were the main reason why they left. But also when they looked at what employees thought was important in leadership, the technical and the cognitive parts ranked almost last.
Wow.
So in other words, they wanted their bosses to be coaches, to help them, to sort of be a coach to them, to communicate with them, to not solve their problems, but to actually help them problem solve so that they became stronger employees. So it was really around the emotional intelligence competencies that sort of rose to the top when they looked at the really good leaders. So that was an interesting study. And I know, at least, I don't know if you're in your work experience, but I've worked for many different bosses. And that does, I mean, I can see that being a major reason why people, no matter what the perks are or the pay, if you have a boss that's difficult in this round, it's really hard to stay. So that was one of the more recent studies that I remembered. I know that that's also in the book.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's
Good
very
example.
Yeah. I mean, I work with a lot of MBA students, and they come having taken an assessment, a 360 assessment that their peers rank them. And invariably, many score lower on emotional intelligence competencies. And they come and they say, I got to work on these soft skills. And because they think of the analytics and the data and the finance as the hard skills. And I say, no, these are not the soft skills. These are the difficult skills. But they come up repeatedly, inevitably, among the area that at least the MBAs really need to work on. And they're not yet leaders in their organizations. And then my job is to help them develop these skills. So I'm really interested in knowing, you said, managing of promotions is so important. So what concrete strategies the leaders in your study do that would be helpful for those leaders today?
Yeah. I think for many people in the world of work that we talk to, managing emotion is really the most critical. I mean, being aware of emotion, being able to identify emotions accurately, that's important, understanding. But, ultimately what they want to know is, how can leaders deal with anxiety situations, a sense of frustration, irritability, those kinds of emotions. So looking at the leaders in our study, there were three basic strategies that they used to manage their emotions. The first one was to change the way in which they were thinking about the situation. The second was to change the situation itself. And the third was to seek out help from other people, help in managing their own emotions. So let me give you a couple examples that illustrate those three approaches. The first one is another one of our favorite stories. It was told to us by, we'll call him Tom. Tom was working for one of the largest steel companies in the country, and he had just been promoted into the position of general manager for the plant that provided steel for one of the major automobile companies. So this was a very important plant, a very important job. And he had been on the job only about a week when he visited the auto company with his top management team for a meeting that occurred every year. And at this meeting, his leadership team sat down with about 20 engineers from the automobile company just to review what had happened during the year and how their plant had performed compared to other plants. So he walked in, he didn't really have any expectations for the meeting, sat down, and for the next 20 minutes or more, he had to sit there listening to the engineers essentially say, your plant is at the bottom in every single measure. Product quality, on-time delivery, responses to problem. You just stink in everything. So Tom, completely caught off guard, nevertheless was able to pull himself together. He sat there, he asked questions, and at the end of the meeting, or at the end of this tirade, he stood up and he said, if you guys wanted to fire us at this point, I wouldn't blame you. I mean, if I were in your position, I think that's what I'd do. But if you're willing to give us another chance, I promise you, when we meet again next year, we will have moved from the bottom to one of the very top. And they were given the other opportunity. So we were obviously very impressed. I was the one interviewing him. And I said something like, wow, well, what were you thinking when you were hearing all this bad news? And he said, well, to tell you the truth, my first impulse was, the first thing I thought was, how in the world, I mean, what have I gotten myself into here? And I mean, he was ready to run out and, just send in his resignation. And then he looked around the table at his management team, and he was thinking, you guys were the ones who were here when this all happened. So he, the thought crossed his mind, when we get back to the plant on Monday, I'm really going to clean house. But then he said, early in my life, I learned that when you react to something like this viscerally, it's usually not a very good idea. So I managed to calm myself down. And I said, how did you do that? And what he described were 3 things that he told himself that other leaders describing other incidents had also mentioned in one form or another. First thing he said, he reminded himself, the world is really a complicated and messy place. So, I should have expected, I mean, this is, maybe messier than usual, but, this is the way things often are, Murphy's Law. So that kind of helped them to calm down. It helped them normalize it. The other thing he said was, and because I'm in the position I'm in, when I'm dealt with a problem, it's usually a real doozy. Because the smaller problems, the more manageable problems, the less risky problems, people at lower levels have already dealt with that. So I better get used to dealing with situations like this. And then the third thing he reminded himself of, which helped him to calm down, was, it's easy to blame these guys on my team. But, usually the world is more complicated than that. It's, when something like this happens, it's not the fault of one person or even a group of people. Let's just kind of step back, listen to what the engineers from the auto company have to say, and figure out what we need to do to move forward. So that was really an example, I think, of how a leader dealing with anger and fear and dread and loathing and all these different things, was able to manage his own emotions by reminding himself of these things and sort of changing the way in which he was looking at the situation.
Interesting.
Now, the other example that I wanted to share with you illustrates the other two strategies. This was a guy who was the president of a wholesale food distributor, and he would meet with their customers, their major customers, periodically to see how things were going and to negotiate a new contract. And there was this one customer who he always dreaded meeting with, because this guy did something to push his buttons that just really destroyed his ability to negotiate a good contract. And no matter what he did to prepare himself, he would come away from those meetings with a contract that was really horrible from his company's point of view. So one day, shortly before he was going to have one of these meetings, he was talking to one of his close friends, actually a somewhat older guy who was also, well, he had been in a number of very high-level executive positions in business, and he had sort of become the mentor and coach for the president of this wholesale distributor. So he explained, what he was about to face, and his coach said, well, why do you have to do it? Why don't you have one of your top people go and meet with him and negotiate the contract rather than subject yourself to that again? And he said, that sounds like a good idea. Certainly be easier for me. And so that's what he did. And of course, he was very eager to hear the report. One of his executives who did this came back, showed him the contract. It was the best contract they ever had. So that was an example of those other two strategies. First of all, he changed the situation by removing himself from what was causing most of the emotional distress. So that was really, managing the interpersonal boundaries very skillfully. And the other thing it illustrates is how he got the idea to do that from a very trusted confidant who had really kind of taken on the role of coach. And those were the three strategies that we saw over and over again that the leaders used to help them deal with their own emotions and also the emotions of other people. And in the book, we describe those strategies and give a lot of other examples of how leaders use those.
Right. Because I think that when reading the book, these strategies are very detailed and explained, but how do people actually learn to use them? I mean, we're talking to some degree about changing behavior, which is something as adults we don't ever want to do. So it's very hard to do anyway. And I know when I work with people, it's all about changing behavior. So how do people actually learn these strategies to become more emotionally intelligent?
So Amanda,
well, first of all, you have to read the book, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Well,
thank you. You have the book. Excellent. Yeah, good.
I'd like to answer that
All right,
one
because
I think, in each of the chapters for the 9 strategies, at the very end of each chapter are activities, and they're activities that are meant to target or help people think about and possibly use an idea from those activities to practice those strategies in real life. So I kind of was thinking about it the other day, and I think the activities have like an inside and an outside point to them. And by inside, I mean that one of the ways that they help is they help with self-awareness, right? Which is the cornerstone of emotional intelligence. But then there's that part of taking action. What are you going to do? And so the activities also have a very practical point. And if I can share with you at least one of the activities, if we have time. I'll just do it very quickly. And I was thinking about this from, you know, I don't know about you, but I'm on a lot of Zoom meetings. We're all Zoomed out, I'm sure. But, and of course, this was written, you know, before the pandemic. But I was thinking it's still very much, since I lead some meetings on Zoom, it's still very much something that people can use today. So one of it was monitoring the emotional climate at your next meeting. So how do you do that? So there's some questions that we lead people who are thinking of becoming leaders, you know, current day leaders. We lead them through some questions to keep in mind as they take on a more observant role of a meeting. So we actually have leaders block off, okay, you know, this meeting, I'm going to take a little bit more of a back seat instead of actually being a hands-on facilitator. And sometimes you need to make arrangements for that to happen. So somebody can maybe help with the meeting management part. But in any case, we ask, you know, what kind of nonverbal behavior do you see? And I know on Zoom you see a lot of things going on, but you can detect nonverbal behavior. You may not be able to investigate it as fully, but you can detect things that are happening.
Can you just move a little bit over on my, yeah, you were being cut off. I don't know if others were as well. I could only see 3/4 of your face. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's funny. I don't see myself. Okay. I'm on my iPhone because my laptop wasn't working with this. So anyway, hopefully you can see me, but let me know. But anyway, and it leads you through a series of different questions. And is there, like, do people seem distracted, uninterested, or are they engaged? Who's arriving late, you know, to the meetings? And if you're in person, who sits next to who? And so these are just data points. They're not necessarily explanations, but they're data points that after the meeting, if there was somebody present in the meeting that you could go to and just ask a general question, what did you think of that meeting? And see how people respond, you know, and see what kind of feedback you get. So you can begin to understand maybe some of the emotional dynamics that might be going on. Again, this is, you're getting information. They're not necessarily, your hypothesis may not be accurate, but you're getting a sense of what might be underlying some of the dynamics in the meeting. So anyway, that's just an activity for one. Again, there's 8 others, and they all pertain to the strategy of that particular chapter. Yeah.
And it seemed as if reading the strategies, a lot of them have to do with developing your own self-awareness, knowing yourself as sort of, yeah.
Right. Right.
We just have about a minute before Janie's going to bring in the audience's questions. So in 1 minute, I'm just curious to know, you've been around studying emotional intelligence for so long, Cary. What, if anything, really surprised you in the findings for this book?
Well, it's interesting. You know, we were talking about this the other day, and Cornelia also answered it. And it turned out that we both identified the same thing in this big book with all these strategies. The thing that both of us found most surprising was that strategy I just described a minute ago, which involved the leaders going to someone else when they had a problem managing emotion. I mean, these people were superstars, supposedly, when it came to managing emotions. They'd been doing this for a lot of time, and yet they still reached out to others for help fairly often when they had to deal with these situations. So I think that was probably the most surprising.
Well, that's good for me as a coach, as a leadership coach. You know.
That's right. You're not going to go out of business very soon.
Especially now with the leadership challenges that people at all levels of organizations are facing in this world. Yeah, great. Well, thank you both so much for talking to me and talking to this audience. I hope there are questions people have asked. So I'll turn it back over to Jamie at the library and see if she wants to share with us what's on everyone else's mind besides mine.
Thanks, Amanda.
Yeah, my pleasure. So.
Hi again, everybody. Yes, thank you so much, Amanda. That was great interviewing. The conversation was so fascinating and really, really well done. I'm going to just make Amanda go small. She'll still be here online. Amanda, you can actually still speak up. I'll leave your microphone on. I'm just going to toggle your video down so that we have a better look at the screen. Okay, so there we are. Okay, we don't have a lot of questions yet, but I'm going to encourage you can put them right in the chat or the ask a question. But we do have one good question from a David Campbell, who is wondering about the importance of emotional intelligence in dealing with racial justice in the workplace. And how important then would emotional intelligence be in this moment with all that's going on around racial justice?
Yeah, it's a very good question, especially with what's going on now. I think that, first of all, it involves values, it involves specific competencies having to do with experiences with other people who are different from ours. So I don't think it's just a matter of emotional intelligence, but I think that a person's ability to perceive, understand, and manage emotion can really help, particularly when there are these confrontations and attempts for people to communicate with each other about an issue which is among the most emotionally loaded of any issue in our society. So the more emotional the issue, the more important emotional intelligence is going to be in helping people to talk about it, to find viable solutions, and just to better understand each other. So it definitely plays an important role in terms of social racial justice.
And do you have thoughts on that, Cornelia?
Well, I guess as I was thinking about, even in terms of my own development in that area, I think increasing your self-awareness around your own racial group has been really important in understanding that. So, and so that's tied into self-awareness, and also understanding, gaining an understanding of groups also that are not like yourself, and understanding what are their concerns and things like that, and how do you work together to create a more just workplace. So it absolutely touches on emotional intelligence, but it is, I have to say, when I read the question, I was thinking, that's a big one. That's a really big one.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's a question. What do you see as obstacles to developing emotional intelligence? And I guess as a corollary to that, I'm going to just add my own thought, because I was thinking about so if there is a leader without emotional intelligence, then is that something that can be developed? So what are the obstacles for someone developing it? And if there is a leader who is very lacking in that area, how do you even let them know that they're lacking in that area, and how do you start getting them to develop it? Especially if you're one of their, if you're working for them, say, for instance.
One approach that's been used a lot, and that, in fact, Amanda talked about it a few minutes ago, it's one she uses in her coaching work, is multi-rater or 360-degree assessment and feedback. Now, when it's used just as a development tool, and the person who's in charge of the assessment and who provides the feedback to someone who, let's say, is not a very emotionally intelligent leader, if that person's really skillful, getting the message from people who work under him or her, bosses, customers, peers, if they're all saying the same thing, which is essentially, you have some strengths, but in these areas of emotional and social intelligence, not so good. That can sometimes start to open up the willingness to work on one's emotional intelligence. There are other ways that it can be done. I think I'm reminded, actually, I sat in on a program that was being done by one of these companies on emotional intelligence several years ago. And during one of the breaks, I sat down with one of the participants and I said, why are you here? And I almost regretted asking the question, because he said, well, I've now been accused of sexually harassing an employee twice. And I've been told that unless I come here and find a way to fix it, I'm going to be out of here. And maybe it is emotional intelligence, because I was never aware of what was going on. I was never aware of the way in which I was coming across. So, that's, it's sort of like in working with addicts. Sometimes they have to hit bottom before they're willing to start looking at themselves more honestly and trying new things in their lives. But Cornelia, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah.
I guess the thought I had was around the barriers to emotional intelligence, which sometimes don't lie within the individual. Sometimes organizations are unemotionally intelligent, or whatever the saying is. There are things in place that don't allow either one's emotional intelligence to shine. It doesn't allow it to grow. So when I'm thinking about when people are asking to develop emotional intelligence, I kind of look at the whole picture, because particularly if you don't have senior management that sees that as an important quality to have at work, then that's like hitting your head against a door over and over. So things need to change from a cultural point of view. And so it's both. It's in terms of, and I also think too, it doesn't have to be, oftentimes training, when people kind of return from training, that workshop high can tend to fade over time. And, you're back in the stressful work environment and the pressures that come with the job. And that kind of can let a lot of things can go out the window with that. Yeah. So I think we highlight an organization in the book that has discussion groups. They're fairly, I wouldn't say they're really formal, but they're more discussion groups with employee groups who talk about, the topic of emotional intelligence in terms of their day-to-day sort of workings. And eventually, I think that program is led by actually management. So, I mean, talk about fostering a sense of that the whole organization was in it together. But there are smaller things that people can do, like right in their everyday work life, that can actually help develop emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's
that's a good example.
Yeah, that's a great example. Here's another question then. Is it possible to have like emotional intelligence burnout in a public facing position? I don't know if that, maybe it's emotional. So I guess I'm trying to look at that question, but is it like, I'm a public services librarian. It's a very emotionally draining job. It's a very pleasurable job. I love my job, but it does take a lot of empathy some days and a lot of, you're dealing with the public. That's so, and I have seen, and we talk about that a lot in librarianship about emotional burnout. But is emotional burnout, then I guess maybe it's not what this question is getting at, but is emotional burnout the same related to emotional intelligence, or yes or no? Is it having too much emotional intelligence that you can't separate what is happening in the workplace from?
Yeah, burnout is a response to stress. And more specifically, it involves the failure to cope effectively with stress. So after people have tried for a period of time to reduce the stress, whatever the source might be, and have not been able to do much about it, that is when they're most likely to burn out. And what burnout involves is a kind of emotional exhaustion followed by a disengagement from the work. So in a sense, in the more advanced stages, burnout is an effective coping strategy. But of course, the worker is not as satisfied or fulfilled and is not performing as well as they did before. And where emotional intelligence comes in is it involves a person's ability to cope with stress, to avoid situations that are stressful. When they're in a situation that's stressful, to be able to change the way in which they're thinking about it, or to change the situation. Like the guy who just stopped going to those really stressful meetings, and problem solved. So he was less likely to burn out. So that I think is the relationship between burnout and emotional intelligence.
So it's emotional intelligence, and it's also the ability to emotionally regulate yourself, is what you're saying, to know when you need to remove yourself from a stressful situation. And I'm going to ask then just a personal question for me, and this is something that I've used as a strategy, and I want to know, as I'm trying to understand myself, all of what we're talking about here. So when I was in library school and we were talking about being public service librarians, our professor very wisely said, if you are having an encounter with somebody at the reference desk and that person is being very intolerant or abusive or difficult to deal with, instead of thinking, oh, this is a difficult person, thinking you just need to reframe it and think this is probably a nice person having a difficult day and I need to help them. And so to me, that's always helped me when I've encountered somebody who, you're thinking I'm really trying to help this person and they're not buying into me, is to step back and say, this is not necessarily a difficult person. Maybe they're having a difficult day.
Yeah. No, and that's a wonderful example of that first strategy that we talked about in managing emotion, changing the way you think about the situation. That's great.
Yeah. Okay. I don't see any other questions here. I'm going to quickly bring Amanda back to join us. And we're going to do a closing down. Well, so I want to thank Amanda for bringing this program to the attention of the library. As I said, Amanda lives here in Princeton, and she wrote to me, and I'm so glad that she did. This book is in our collection at the library. If anybody who is local would like to borrow it, and I hope it's in other libraries as well. If not, there's the link at the bottom to purchase the book. And also Dr. Cherniss sent to me, let me see if I can go into here again. There was a link that he sent because an excerpt was in fastcompany.com when that was just last week. Yeah. So again, if you want to just kind of get a little sample of what the book is like before you purchase, you can go there. And I just put the link back in again. So go to fastcompany.com, and the article is called Why Successful Leaders Pay Special Attention to Their Company's Emotional Climate. So take a look at that article, and good luck with all of your future work and promotions of the book. And please stay in touch. I think this, this is all about leadership, but maybe at some point you'll want to come. We have a great group at our library every Friday morning for people who are job seeking. So maybe they need to get in touch with their emotional intelligence, and it's because I could imagine job seekers in this time, they're probably going through a lot right now emotionally, and needing all the support they can.
Absolutely.
So please do stay in touch. And again, you can also go to thecrowdcast.io/PrincetonPL and sign up to follow along. We have lots of other great events coming up this fall, including tomorrow night. We have on Nancy Pearl talking to Madeline Miller. Nancy Pearl is known as America's librarian. She's a famous in library circles for her readers advisory skills. She is a superstar, and she did a book called The Writer's Library, where she interviewed dozens of authors about what they like to read. And Madeline Miller, of course, is an award-winning author herself who lives in the Philadelphia area. She's one of the writers featured in the book. So it's going to be a really great talk for book lovers tomorrow night. But we have lots of other events coming up, including some on voting with the League of Women Voters, or lots more author talks. Marie Hinojosa coming up next week. So again, follow along. Thank you, guys. And I'm going to wish all of you the best of luck. And it was so lovely to meet you and work with you. Thank you.
Thank
You
you.
too.
Thank you,
Jamie.
Jamie.
Good night, everybody.